Thank you for joining us for this episode of Bridging the Gap. I'm your host, Adam Montella, and I'm SummitET's Senior Vice President. Joining me today is three special guests: John Duda, who's SummitET's founder and CEO, Scott Glick, who's SummitET's General Counsel, and interestingly, before joining Summit, one of Scott's positions was as the Director of Preparedness for the Department of Justice. And also joining us is no stranger to this field, Pete Gaynor, former DHS Acting Secretary and the Administrator at FEMA. Welcome, gentlemen, to this first of two episodes talking about exercise effectiveness. In today's episode, we're going to discuss a new tool called the XF Score. And in the following episode, we'll talk a little bit more about how tools like the XF Score lead into better after-action reporting and following through on those after-action reports once they're written. Now, John, we're here today to talk a little bit about exercises, in particular, a new tool called the XF Score. This past July, the Domestic Preparedness Journal published an article that you and Scott wrote entitled "Creating a New Standard for Evaluating Tabletop Exercises." Now, briefly describe for us the different kinds of exercises, about the XF Score and where it kind of fits in here.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. As we're looking at this, the two prominent exercises that most organizations will focus on are discussion-based, which are bringing people around a table, the appropriate stakeholders, to address a plan, policy, or maybe a procedure to walk through it in a hypothetical scenario and test and validate plans. The second being a full-scale exercise or operational exercise, I should say, and that would be actually deploying assets and whether it be people, equipment, and staging them in a case in which a scenario would play out in the most real life possibility outside of an actual event and testing it that way. So as you were hitting on, Scott and I, we worked on a paper, the XF Score, this last July. It was published in the Domestic Preparedness Journal. That started back in 2010 when I started. I was an exercise planner working as a contractor to the federal government and identified that early on that there wasn't a lot of ability to gauge quantitative results in tabletop exercises specifically. So this research carried through. I published that portion of my paper in 2012 at Johns Hopkins, and really addressed some of what I observed in across the exercise community that was lacking, including in the current, at that time, HSEEP, Homeland Security Exercise Evaluation Program.
Yeah, as we know, in full-scale exercises and drills, there's more operational-based ones. It's easier to have a quantitative result or also qualitative. So how well we did something and how fast we did something can be measured. But in a tabletop, it seems like it would be a little more difficult to get that quantitative assessment. So why does it matter in a tabletop exercise that we get both a quantitative and qualitative result?
As we see, a lot of times you have, whether it be action officers or senior leaders or officials at tabletop exercises, you're typically walking through and getting, whether they be verbal or written responses back on how, whether a plan, how they support a plan or would respond to a hypothetical scenario. Having the quantitative results to complement the qualitative feedback provides a greater objective view and picture of the effectiveness of an exercise. And more importantly, what Scott and I really hit on is getting a quantitative response to the most important items in an exercise to be tested or validated, which are the core objectives of an exercise.
So Scott, can you describe for us the current assessment tools being used to evaluate tabletop exercises and why the need for this tool?
Yeah, so as John pointed out, in the beginning, HSEEP, which becomes somewhat of a standard in part because there's a number of grants that FEMA and DHS provide to state and locals to develop exercises and to do things, provided that they're in compliance with HSEEP. So it's become sort of a standard. In the beginning, HSEEP didn't have a standard. It then developed a quantitative assessment tool by using what's called the Likert scale, where you would rate on 1 to 5 from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And that became a quantitative type of measurement because if you could assign a score, a series of 5s to a series of questions, you'd get a numerical number which would be beyond the qualitative. Do I think this is a good situation, or some sort of answer that I gave, which was a qualitative answer. So they started to develop this type of quantitative assessment. The challenge, though, with HSEEP and where our article and our new methodology comes in is that if you're not asking the right questions or you're not giving the proper weight to the more important questions, even though you're using a quantitative tool, you're not getting the most objective assessment of where the exercise is taking you and what your evaluation is of that exercise.
Right.
So, for example, if we all had breakfast this morning and we said, how was the meal, and we all gave it very low marks, we might get a numerical number, we might get a quantitative number. But if we didn't ask questions as, was the meal bad because the service was poor, or was the meal bad because the food was lousy, or the attitude of the waiter or the waitress, we wouldn't be getting as accurate an assessment even with that assessment tool. So what we needed to do in the beginning, as John says, there was none. He started to develop one, and then where we took the rubric that he developed was we tried to make sure that we were doing weighting to the questions in the proper way. And so the distinction between asking the right questions and giving them the right weights to those questions really is now where the article that we've published and the XF score is going towards.
Okay, so in most tabletops for the last 25 years, we engage participants to get feedback, but typically what you see in an after action report or in the participant feedback is how well the exercise was conducted, or how was the the temperature of the room. Looking at the design of the exercise than an evaluation of your plans, policies, and procedures. How quickly or was the response quality? Did it meet up to the standards that we established? You could see that in a full scale or a drill or a functional exercise, but you can't really see that in a tabletop. So what kind of questions, John, does your new evaluation method use, or how do we get granular in a tabletop to answer those kinds of questions to make them more valuable?
Yeah, so when I first developed the rubric in 2011 is when I think I actually had the rubric fully developed. I started sharing this across various agencies, to various feds and the DoD and federal agency side, because it was something that we were still not hitting on, essentially, that we're not addressing the core points to Scott's, his response, that do we have the stakeholders' true objectives identified prior to the start of an exercise that we're going to measure to ensure those organizations are better prepared? And so as we've seen the last 2 or 3 versions of HSEEP get updated, there's been some progress, but the reason why Scott and I decided to actually write this article and develop the XF score is because it's still not getting to the point of really putting the most weight to that core area of having the appropriate stakeholders identified, capturing their true objectives of what is looking to be accomplished to ensure an exercise can be determined if it was effective. So that was really it. So one might be, the specific to test the specific agency's response to maybe an explosion in a specific area, and so for that specific objective, which agencies are actually being incorporated in that might be in that response. Did it improve that response in some way, or additional agencies needing to be added to a plan? So there's a lot of carry on specific questions in the rubric that can be added to ensure you meet that objective of that exercise.
And just to underscore that a little bit more precisely, so what the XF score is doing and what our article is doing is that it's making sure that when you're asking questions, you're asking the right questions. So here's an example of an HSEEP question. The exercise scenario was plausible and realistic. So you're going to rate that between 1 and 5, or exercise participants included the right people in terms of level and mix of disciplines. These are actual questions that were currently being asked. They may be important questions, but they're not as important as, like, what are we trying to achieve? What is the objective? So what the XF score does is it makes sure that you're asking questions that include not only these, but that are driven by what the exercise objective is, what you're trying to achieve, and you give those questions greater weight than these other questions. And so if you conduct, for example, an exercise over a period of time using this new methodology that we've come up with, and you see your scores rising over time, you now have a more objective, reliable way of knowing, hey, I think the money that I'm spending on my exercise is better.
Let me key in on that. That's a key point, Scott. It's a return on investment at all levels. So from yourself as an individual, if you wrote the plan, or your plan stakeholder, did I improve, or did I use the plan as intended? If I'm the chief of department or the head of an agency, is the money I invested in developing this plan or this policy or these procedures, or this equipment purchase, did it improve our posture? Did it improve our position? And if you go all the way up to the federal level, Congress wants to know, is this money that we're giving out for exercise conduct or preparedness activities being effective? And no stranger to that is our next guest, Pete Gaynor. Pete, all the way from the time you were in the Marines through your tenure as the FEMA Administrator and the Acting DHS Secretary, you weren't really an exercise expert, were you? You were kind of the Uber customer, if you will. Also looking as an agency head, the effectiveness or the ROI for the involvement of your staff, all the way down to the locals that you support. You want to talk a little bit, Pete, about your involvement in the space and how you see this new evaluation tool?
And you're right. I'm not an exercise professional, but I am a customer of exercise, and I think no matter where I sat, I always the first question I ask is, like, why are we doing this exercise? Like, why is this exercise important to me as the director or the administrator, or to our organization, or to the jurisdiction that we represent? Like, how is this going to make us better? And I think, and I'm not sure, Adam, you alluded to it. I think the way we have done exercises is kind of, I'll call it the legacy way. We need an exercise, right? Because somebody's probably funding it. It's probably a good thing to do an exercise, right? I think just in general, and it's a check in the box. So let's go do an exercise. But I think to the point of John and Scott is, yeah, you have to do an exercise for all the right reasons, but what is the outcome you're trying to generate from that exercise, and how can we better score and be more critical of the exercise, the plan that supports it, all those things that go into it. I think as a profession, especially when it comes to exercises, we're not critical enough of ourselves, right? So the qualitative aspect of some of these scoring methodologies, people are unwilling to be really, really, truly honest about what they've seen, or others, or even their own performance, right? So I think we need to have another way to measure in a more honest way to get the results that we all want, right? And that's to improve, whether it's a plan or our overall preparedness. We need to be a little bit harder on ourselves. We need to get a little bit more critical of ourselves. And I think, we probably need to test a little bit more towards failure and not towards the success. And that may be, people may look at that as, well, why would we want to fail? And I'll just close here is that I think if you walk out of an exercise where it's all rosy, then you did fail. I think when you walk out of exercise and you really pulled out the things that matter, that made it fail or made it succeed, but really I think the greater value is in the failures. And if you had a rubric like the XF score, does that get you there, right? Does that make you better? So.
Excellent point. And something you said reminded me of, I've been in this business, exercise business since '99, back in the Nunn-Lugar Domenici domestic preparedness days. And the person that headed up the entire program was a guy named John Bond, who ended up going to DHS as the critical infrastructure guy. But he taught us, when we're building exercises, you want to hold a mirror up to yourself and get that unvarnished look that nobody else sees, because you can look at yourself in the mirror and be critical where you don't really want to have others be critical of you. The other thing he talked about was, exercise implies you're getting stronger. In physical exercise, as in a training exercise. So those are two great points, Pete, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. We don't really fully measure how we're doing, nor do we carry it into our overall improvement posture. So this is a great first step, is to get that granular information. So Scott and John, you also developed a checklist for developing tabletop exercises, or the design part of exercises. Can you talk a little bit about that, Scott, and how that fits into what we're talking about today?
Sure. So the checklist, which we've developed, which anyone can download on the SummitET.com website, is just a one-pager. Includes a lot of things that have been out there in terms of exercise design. We are putting it all in one place so you can have a one-pager to help you design the exercise. That's what's going to happen before the exercise is conducted. You're going to want to make sure you hit each of the things on the checklist to improve the chances that your exercise is successful. So the exercise checklist is what's going to come first. The next thing that's going to happen is you're going to conduct the exercise, and then you're going to be evaluating it. So to Pete's point, as an exercise consumer, why are we conducting this exercise? Did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? What the XF score is going to do is we're going to take that concern and we're going to make sure that we have a very clear objective, that we know why we're conducting the exercise. And then the XF, so that's going to be clear in the checklist that we've got that objective. And then what the XF score is going to do is we're going to measure whether or not we've achieved that objective. We're going to have questions that are designed to be focused on that. And so you're going to have the ability to know from using the XF score, in a quantitative way, not just what people thought subjectively, how they were improved, but you're going to actually have a more quantitative assessment tool to measure that. And so we're going to be able to say to someone like Pete, as a consumer, especially if we see our scores going up over time, that the money we've been spending on this tabletop exercise, this is helping us to improve that. He's going to say, well, how do you know that? And you say, well, our scores are going up. And the scores are not from the questions that are just, did the exercise, was it conducted well? The scores are actually going to be based on questions that are focused on organizational preparedness.
That's a fantastic point, Scott. And we've been talking a lot about government, but this transcends government to private sector, to NGOs, nonprofits, to higher education, to all different sectors. It's almost like developing key performance indicators, KPIs, for an organization. You don't ask different questions every year because you can't measure the difference between where you were and where you are now, or where you're going. You ask the same type of a question or the same question and measure it over time to give you that feedback, which is a great segue in our upcoming episode. We're going to continue this conversation and talk about, now that we've gotten all this information, how do we use it to improve over time, to do continual improvement and build better plans? To close out, let me throw it back to John for any final thoughts. John, Scott, and Pete, any final words from you?
Yeah, Adam, I think in this part one of addressing the exercise effectiveness on specifically our XF score and how we can further the gathering of metrics and the appropriate metrics specifically to ensure an exercise was effective to that organization, that carry over to after action meetings and improvement planning, tying that, ensuring that we are going to actually be able to address further down the road, will be great for us to come back together and discuss that in further detail. Fantastic.
Scott, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would just say that, Adam, you indicated you've been in the space since 1999, and some of us have been for long periods like that as well. It's remarkable that an industry standard for evaluating the effectiveness of tabletop exercises hasn't emerged. We think that the XF score and the way that it assigns weights to different questions, one, and two, how it really focuses the questions, make sure you're asking questions that are based on what the objectives are. We think those two key factors can help lead to a discussion among all of us in this industry and maybe lead to an industry standard. So we look forward to continuing conversations with not only ourselves, but with others in this industry as well.
Thank you, Scott. Pete, do you have any final words of advice for folks?
Yeah, no, I think, it's, we always want these results, right, before we walk into this thing. And I think if you don't properly prepare for that, you don't ask the hard questions, or you don't have a hard evaluation, you will not get what you wish for. So I'm all for asking more pointed questions or evaluating in a more pointed way to get the result that you really desire.
Right.
I'm all for a little bit more pressure on participants. I don't think there's enough pressure on participants sometimes, and it becomes a walk in the park many times. We all did a great job, and we go to lunch. And then again, I think we'll talk about this in another episode, is how does that feed into the most critical part of this, is the improvement plan, because that's what the exercise is really designed to do, is make you more effective. All these things are together, are a comprehensive way to do that. So it was a great discussion today.
Thank you, Pia. It's amazing. We spend 6 months, sometimes a year, planning an exercise, but we spend maybe a collective month or two building a plan. Do we test the plan effectively? Do we follow up on the after action reports? I look forward to discussing that with you gentlemen in the next episode. So in closing, is there a place for HSEEP in the future? Most certainly. HSEEP is becoming that de facto standard, although it as pointed out through John's research in this article, we can always improve. Just as we're improving our plans, we can improve HSEEP with some more granular tools. The bottom line is we have to ask ourselves, is my organization better prepared today, having gone through this exercise? And if you can't answer that question, maybe it wasn't a good use of everybody's time. With that, I'll leave you all, and thank you for joining us on this Bridging the Gap.
Thank you.